Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on Microsoft Azure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the folks joining from different parts of the globe. My name is Nur Basha, Associate Marketing Director at Winwire Technologies, and I'll be a moderator for today's webinar. As you can see on the screen, today's topic for the session is Building the Intelligent Cloud with Microsoft Azure, where we will cover about Azure virtual machines, Azure Storage, Azure SQL, along with few quick demos. Before we start, let me highlight a few housekeeping items. During the webinar, please feel free to post questions and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. Recording of this session will be shared to you in next 24 to 48 hours. So before that, let me introduce you to today's session speaker and my colleague, Mr. David Armstrong. David is the Vice President of Technology Solutions at Winwire Technologies and brings over 25 plus years of experience in the IT industry. He has been focused on application development, mainly on the Microsoft platforms. David spent close to 8 plus years working for Microsoft as a principal consultant, designing and implementing enterprise class solutions to several customers. And with that, I would like to turn it over to David. David, over to you.
Thank you, Noor, and I'd like to greet everyone on the session. Again, my name is David Armstrong. I am the VP of Technology Solutions here at Winwire. I'm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as Noor said, I have a high concentration on application development. I do support our pre-sales team here. I am part of the pre-sales team, and I do support our sales team as well. So today, we're going to talk about we're going to go into Azure a little bit. It's really a high-level introduction into Azure. We're going to discuss what Azure is. We're going to talk about some basic concepts in Azure, virtual machines, Azure Storage. We're going to talk about regular Microsoft on-prem SQL, and we're also going to talk about Azure SQL. We'll talk about connectivity options to Azure, and we're going to discuss virtual networks as well. So we have a lot of high-level topics to discuss, and I'm just going to kind of jump into what exactly is Azure. So it's an open and flexible cloud platform, right? So that means that you can bring your on-prem applications and start hosting them up in the cloud. You're building and managing your applications essentially across the global network, right? It doesn't have to be. There are data centers dispersed all throughout the world, and we'll get to that very shortly. And the very big advantage is that you're using many tools today, right? You're not buying new tools to develop on the Azure solution, and again, we'll get into that. And finally, you can integrate with public cloud applications such as Microsoft Office 365. So how about some of the advantages? Why would you use the cloud? Typically, when you're deploying new applications, you have to build out your infrastructure, buy more hardware, budget for more hardware, get your IT team to do all that provisioning, right? And so it's faster to do that in the cloud because Microsoft has quite the infrastructure to do that for you already. And then your application development is the same way. You can control your application development. It's really at your speed on how fast you want to deploy. Typically, it's a lower cost model because of the infrastructure that Microsoft provides is cheaper than your infrastructure. So, for instance, you're not necessarily licensing VMware, for instance, or you're not hosting your own SAN, right? And we're going to get into this more in depth, but those are just a couple of examples. And then finally, you can scale your environment out, right? So you're not having hardware that's sitting in hot standby mode or anything like that, or you're ordering hardware in an emergency. In this case, as you need to, you can scale out based on schedules, or you can establish metrics, for instance, when CPU or memory thresholds are exceeded, and that allows you to automatically add resources and also throttle them down. So the purpose of this slide is really just to show you how far Azure has advanced, right? And this is a snapshot, right? So there are 28 regions worldwide, 22 are online, and this continues to grow. And so my point is that you're taking advantage of quite an infrastructure that Microsoft is building out. and for a company to build out this type of infrastructure is almost cost prohibitive just to run their own private cloud. In this slide, we see not only the 28 regions and the 22 online, but you see the platform services that are available to you as companies and developers, and they are a lot of different. Right, so you have multi-factor authentication, content delivery network, developer services like platform as a service tables, and different types of storage. We're going to just kind of gloss through some of these. You see that sitting on top of all of the Azure infrastructure. So for instance, virtual servers and virtual networks, and that's all just available to you with you just starting an Azure subscription. Again, this is a snapshot of just the different types of Azure compliance that has been obtained. So if this is important to you and your company, the good news is you can schedule a tour of an Azure data center, and they'll take you through, they'll show you the procedures of how things are secured. Now, obviously, they're not going to get too deep, but it's an impressive tour to go on, and it'll allow you to just really have a sense of security that you can host your applications inside of Azure. We get a lot of questions about Azure being Microsoft only, and it really, yes, there are a lot of Microsoft services on there, but it's really an open cloud, right? So you can see a lot of the tools, a lot of the management tools and application frameworks. This list grows every day. Right now, the comparison is about 60% non-Microsoft workload versus a 40% Microsoft workload inside of Azure. So clearly, the world outside of Microsoft is definitely embracing Azure, and just keep an open mind if you're serious about hosting Linux, Apache, and those types of frameworks. Let's talk a little bit about the cloud model in general, right? So a lot of companies today are shifted to the left. They are typically on-premise, and so of course with that, it's higher cost, but the advantage is you have more control. Many companies are shifting to the middle, where they're willing to take their infrastructure as a service and kind of manage it, and then turn over a lot of the nuts and bolts over to Microsoft or other cloud providers for that matter. And then finally, on the right, I think most of the companies are going to be slow to adopt this model, but clearly it's as you start to retire your hardware, you start to retire switches and SANs and your infrastructure, right? Companies are moving to more of a hotel model where employees show up and they do their work, but they're not necessarily connected directly to their data centers. So how do you use Azure? One of the things I'm going to show you in a moment is the Azure Management Portal. It's the gateway into Azure. In terms of tools, right, you saw all the tools that were listed a few slides ago, but Microsoft Visual Studio is probably the most prominent tool that you're going to see used. And then you also see PowerShell is a huge portion of Azure, right? So in terms of Azure Management Portal, yes, you can do a lot of things, but when you need to start getting down into the weeds, a lot of administrators prefer to use PowerShell or the Azure command line interface. And then finally, the custom code inside of Visual Studio calling the ARM API, the REST API. So if you can't do it inside of one of the Portal or Visual Studio or PowerShell, then finally you can get down into the definite weeds and you can code right to the lowest level interfaces. Again, we just discussed the consistent tooling. The other thing I want to mention here is the custom templates, right? So many customers don't know that you can implement your own version of Azure inside of your data center, and then it can talk directly to the Azure data centers worldwide, and we'll start to show that here in a few moments. So that's really just a high-level introduction to Azure. And what I want to jump into right now is really one of the base concepts of Azure, and that's the infrastructure as a service, or virtual machines. in this case. So some of the advantages, you can deploy them on demand. You can scale them up and scale them down, right? So for instance, we'll show the different SKUs that are available and how you can auto resize them. You're paying for what you use. So for instance, when you are running, you can allocate so much CPU, you can allocate so much memory, so much disk space, and you're using it. We're going to talk about availability sets, which basically allows you to scale out your virtual machines. And it's just some of the options to run workloads. You can see some of the metrics, 1 to 32 CPUs, up to 448 gig of memory. Multiple operating systems are supported. And finally, we'll get into the solid-state disk storage or Azure Storage as well. If you're getting into Azure, this tool, the pricing tool, really helps you to understand things from a networking, a storage, virtual machines. And so basically what you'll do is you'll go down and you'll look at the different pricing after you establish a subscription. So what I'm going to do is I want to jump into a demo. What I've done is I brought up my copy of the Azure, not the copy, but my instance of the Azure portal that I'm signed into. So I'm signed in through my Visual Studio subscription, which gives me about $200 a month to really experiment in Azure and try to just do all kinds of things. So basically, for those who are new to the portal, what I should show you is one, I started this. This is Microsoft Edge browser. There are other browsers that are supported. I started this in a new private window, and I signed in using my credentials. Okay, so that's what I did to come on board. So you can do things like create new, right? So these are the basic things, right? So you can search the Azure Marketplace. You can create some of the recent things you can see that I've done. I've created a SQL database. I've created Windows Server 2012 R2. You can kind of see some of the different developer tools and things like that. One of the more important tabs here is all the different resources that I have set up inside of here. We'll kind of go into those in a little bit. And finally, you can see the virtual machines, the SQL databases, information about my subscription. If you had an Active Directory that you're syncing up with, anything that you want to monitor, you can look at security alerts. You can come down here and go through and look at your billing. And your billing is updated pretty much every day, so that you're not really getting surprised on how much you're billing, how much you're spending. Okay, so let's go in and create a new virtual machine. So what I want to do is I'm going to come in here and I want to search, let's just say I search for Visual Studio. Okay, and I'll click on one. Right, so I see a couple of things that come up here. I see Visual Studio Community 2015, and some have the Azure SDK Update 3 with Azure SDK, so I'm just going to pick one here. Okay, and you can kind of see how things are moving along. In terms of a resource manager, let's see what we got going on here. Okay, let's pick okay. I just named it. We can choose. The difference is standard hard drive versus solid state disk. I'm going to assign a user ID and a password. Okay, this is the subscription that I'm working with. Resource groups, I'm going to use an existing one, and this allows me to manage the machine as well as, in addition, I can manage these machines as a group, right? And so think of this as kind of like group policy for domains, but it's really just managing the machines as groups. The previous iteration had classic VMs, and they were all managed in a single instance. Okay, so I've created the first part, and now what this is doing is this is showing me what kind of virtual machines are available. And so it's loading some pricing, and these are estimated pricing right now. And we're going to cover this in just a moment, but I just wanted to show you that if you view all, you can kind of see the different configurations that are available to you. So you can commit to spending $1,100 a month if you wanted to, but you know, it's more reasonable to come down and find something, we'll say in the A2 standard. This is pretty much what I configured to start with, and then you can move up from there. And the good news is, if you make a choice like this, you're not bound to this choice. Okay, so we'll select that. And then I've already created storage accounts here. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but I want to make sure that the correct storage account is chosen. I've already got the VNet, the IP set up, the IP address is already set up. It's already built into, make sure it's built into the same network security group. We are definitely going to cover that in a few moments. The extensions and high availability we're going to leave alone. Monitoring is enabled. Guest diagnostics are disabled. And we'll fix this storage account as well. And then it'll go through and it'll validate everything. And it'll say, yep, everything is good. And now what you can do is you can create this virtual machine. So I can create that. In about 15 minutes, I'll get a message that comes up over here and says this virtual machine has been created. And what I can do is I can download this template so that I don't have to go through all these selections again if I want. And so you can create templates to basically deploy just about any type of machine. So I'm not going to actually create that. Instead, what I've done is I've created inside of prior to this presentation, I created a SQL server and I created a web server. And we're going to kind of jump into those in a little bit when I come back to my next set of demos. So let me switch back to the PowerPoint. Okay, A series is about where you're going to want to start.
Hello there.
A series is where you're going to want to start, and you can kind of see some of the different memory configurations that run down. The D series, that's the, I guess, the first basic. I'm sorry, it's the first of the enterprise machines. And then finally, as you get up to the DSV2 series, that's where you really get into the enterprise class machines. And again, what I would recommend is that you go through and check the pricing and compare those to the machines that you want to make sure that you're paying for what you're using. Let me just switch back and just go through a couple of things here just to make sure folks understand what I'm talking about here. So if we go to the SQL machine, right, you see a connect, and that allows me to establish a remote desktop. This public IP address is not necessarily guaranteed, and so what I did was I set up the www.sequel01.eastus cloud app Azure as a DNS entry. And so if you're doing domains and joining machines to domains, this is going to be a lot different. We'll get to that in a little bit, but if you're just hosting machines, I don't think you want to be dependent upon these IP addresses. Okay. What I was talking about in terms of saving money, if you go through and let's just say that you're in this machine, okay, and you say to yourself, all right, I'm going to shut down this machine, right? So you come here and you go through the typical process of shutting down. That does not turn the meter off in Azure. What turns the meter off in Azure is this stop here. So you want to make sure that you actually, after the machine has gracefully been shut down, you want to do the stop. Okay, and also inside of, let's see, let's go to all resources, and we're going to talk about network security groups in a little bit, but one of the things that I did inside of this network security group is I opened up HTTP on my web server, and I opened up port 3389. And so without that in the network security group, you're not going to get into that. Now, so you don't have to open these up publicly, but in this case, I open them up just so I could get into today's demo. Okay, so let me go back to the slide presentation. Okay, that's it on the Azure Virtual Machine overview. So what I want to do now is move into Azure Storage. So what is Azure Storage, right? It's cloud storage, basically SAN storage in the cloud. That's the best way that I can describe it. So you have data abstractions, which we'll talk about here. So for instance, blobs are like the primary, which are binary large objects, are the primary file system in the cloud. Almost Azure SQL, Skype for Business, they're all built on top of this file system. Okay. If you choose not to use SQL in your application, right, you can still use Azure Tables, right? That's a concept for storing large amounts of scalable structured storage. Queues are the same way, right? If you're used to using MSMQ or IBM's queuing service, then this is Azure Queues, right? And what this allows you to do is basically use Azure to pass messages back and forth. In terms of a pub-sub model where you have publication, publish, and subscription, then you can use Azure Topics, and that allows you to broadcast out messages to multiple subscribers. And finally, you can set up drives with NTS volumes just as you have today, probably in your data centers. Okay, there are two types of storage. Standard storage is just that. It's not necessarily bad, but it is spindle-based storage, right? So you can see some of the but some of the specifications, right? So you can have 500 IOPS per disk. The 1 terabyte per disk storage capacity, that's being addressed, but right now if you need to exceed that, you can strike your disks together. We'll talk about geo-redundancy in just a minute. And then finally, in terms of machines, you can put standard storage on just about any type of machine. Talking about premium storage, that's a solid-state disk. It's, you know, your laptop, most modern-day laptops have that today, but this is not the type of storage that you're going out to Best Buy and buying, right? These are enterprise-class disks, and there's multiple redundancy. You can see that there's a factor of 10 in terms of the IOPS that you can achieve. And then finally, there's only local redundancy here, so you're not going to be spanning data centers. And finally, this type of storage is only available on the upper level machines, the DS and GS sizes. So local redundant storage. If you choose, this is the base option, and you're maintaining 3 copies of data in a single region. So for instance, I'm based here in the United States on the East Coast. So if I put my application here in the US East or US East 2 data center, then I automatically have 3 copies of my data in a single region. Geo-redundant storage, that's 6 copies. That requires you to do a concept of calling pairing with the data center. And so you could pair, for instance, US East and US West, and then your data is moved across the line. So you can see 500 IOPS for standard, and then 300 IOPS for attached disks to a basic VM. Now, I didn't really highlight the basic VM. Basic VMs are really meant to do low-level testing. You're not doing any performance testing, so if you're doing smoke testing on your applications, you can spin these up very quickly, and you're just, again, smoke testing your applications, making sure that they're running correctly. And finally, you see read-only geo-redundant storage, and what that is you have a read-only copy in a secondary data center, and so if the primary copy goes down, you can at least have access to the data in a secondary data center. A little bit more about Azure Premium Storage, right? Again, we said it's a solid-state disk drive. It's more for intensive workloads and high throughput, low latency, and there are no storage transaction charges. So there can be storage transaction charges for the standard disks, and again, use that pricing tool to really understand how your charges can add up. So these the disk types, again, as you saw when I was looking at the virtual machines, you saw, you know, the A level. This is the storage here. So you have P10, which is the entry level for premium storage, and then you see P20 and P30, right? You can see the disk sizes, the IOPS, and see how they scale up. and also the throughput, right? So you can get into your entry level at 100 megabits per second, and you can double that and also double your multiply your IOPS by a factor of 10. And so again, you've got some choices here, and you're going to want to weigh that against the cost. Okay, so moving to Azure SQL. Many companies are using SQL Server on-premise, and that's okay. You can continue to use your SQL Server on-premise, and you can easily move it to the cloud. In fact, I have an instance running here that I'm going to show you. But you can also use Azure SQL in and of itself, okay? And so there are 3 tiers. Again, you have a basic, a standard, and a premium service. And you can see the some of the metrics that are surrounding them. So you have these different SKUs, S0 through S3. This is the magic number here. Okay, if you think that your database is going to exceed 250 gigabytes in size, then you're going to want to start looking at the premium storage. Okay, so you can see that you can get up to a terabyte. You can be 500 gigabytes. You can be up to a terabyte, and you can also see some of the in-memory storage, right? So you're not necessarily seeing that here in the standard version, and then you can also see the scalability that goes through. The point-in-time restore is identical, and then the active geo-replication is also the same features are available. I do want to caution folks that if you're going to use this, it's not necessarily included in the price. Okay, so that means there's an additional price to use this feature both here and both here. So just keep that in mind as you set that up. Anybody who has a lot of experience with working on-prem SQL should kind of really go through and see what the limitations of Azure SQL are. Okay, so the limitations are changing, but you can see, I guess I've listed the top 10 features or lack of features that need to be identified. So for instance, there is no Windows authentication. Many on-prem IaaS applications will set up a Windows service account, and then they will authenticate from IaaS to the database, right? And so this is still supported, it's just not supported using Windows authentication. Same thing with cross-database queries, database diagrams. Many developers store their diagrams inside of the databases, and so that's not supported. Spoofing as a login is not supported. File streams or blobs are not supported. And again, you're seeing what's not supported, but there's also workarounds for just about everything. The SQL agent, so there's an Azure scheduler instead of a SQL agent. The profiler, right? You're doing this on-prem instead of in the cloud. Same thing with the trace and the transact SQL debugging. Okay, and I've included a link here that really gets much more information than what I'm presenting here. Again, I just went through and just highlighted some of the issues that you could run into. Okay, so I think what we're going to do is we're going to switch over and we're going to do another demonstration. So we're going to look at provisioning an Azure SQL database, and then we're going to migrate an existing database into Azure SQL, and then finally I'm going to show some legacy application calling into Azure SQL. Okay, so if we move back into the Azure portal and we go here to SQL databases. Okay, I've got one that's already set up, and in fact, one of the things that I want to show is that they have the firewall enabled on this, and so while I was running through, I noticed that my application wasn't working correctly, and so I had to come in here and make sure that I added my IP range into here so that I could connect to the server. So just making sure that this is not wide open in the cloud, right? You have to open certain ports, and Microsoft will do a lot of that for you. But let's go back to SQL databases here. And what I want to do is I want to add a SQL database, right? This is not anything okay, so we're creating it in the same resource. It's a blank database. You can use one of their sample databases. You can restore from a backup. we're going to talk about elastic pools in just a moment. And here we are selecting the different pricing, okay? And so we had talked about this. You can see here where Microsoft is highlighting their more expensive databases. But if you look through here, you know, you can come through and set up your first basic database for 15 bucks a month. That's not too bad. And even better is $5 a month, okay? So it's not very expensive to start your own SQL database. And then finally, the coalition. Anybody who has familiarity with installing SQL, is you need to install, or you need to select the coalition. So you can create this and away it'll go. I've already got one created, but again, spinning one of these up is very straightforward. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over, and what I have running here is my SQL Server. It's a VM with my not my personal SQL Server, but my MSDN SQL Server, and so it's called www.sql01, and on it is a database just like anybody else's databases. So you've got a demo database, you've got some tables here. So for instance, there's an employee table, and then finally there is a couple of stored procedures here. Let's see. Right, so anybody that's used to writing code will hopefully be writing stored procedures. And of course, if you're using the entity framework, that's all supported as well. But just to show this, I can bring this up, and up comes the store procedure with a select. Very simple, takes an employee ID and brings back some attributes. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to come down to here, and this is my connection into the Azure SQL database, and I've also got a database here, and I'm going to actually drop this database. Okay, so the database has been dropped. Let me just refresh that, make sure there's nothing going on bad here. Okay, so what we can do is inside of the migration assistant, this is just one way to do this, and it's almost a straightforward way, is you can come here, go to tasks, and say, I want to deploy to a Windows Azure SQL database. And so what's going to end up happening is you're going to see a dialog box pop up here. You're going to select a server that you want to migrate to, and so in this case I'm going to pick this guy. You can see I have my credentials already pre-populated. It's going to connect to that, and then what you can do, and I'm sorry for the remote desktop, but it wants you to select the Azure SQL database, right? So you can see that I have standard selected, and then the minimum database size right now is allocated to 250 gig. And then the service objective, right, you can see the coming through as S0 and through S1 and S2, right? And so that's what we've done. And now when I press select, this is just a confirmation that this is going to run. And then finally we'll kind of start this off, and let's just make sure it gets going here. Okay, so you're going to see very similar to any other SSIS package, SQL Server Integration Services package that runs. This is one that's been created on demand, and it's just going in the background to validate the database, extract it, and then you'll see it actually push the database over. So I'm going to let this run. Okay, that's looking like it's running well. What we're going to do is I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio. And so what I wanted to show you is that your existing applications can connect into Azure as opposed to you having to rewrite your entire applications, right? So this is a very trivial form written in ASP.NET. If I switch over to, let's go to the design, you can see I have a very simple grid view. There's absolutely nothing going on here. I'm going to switch back to the code here. And there's a page load that goes and instantiates one of these employee objects, and then finally it goes to the database. It looks to call the store procedure, get employee, which I just showed you, and finally it'll write out an error if it has problems connecting. So let's see how we're doing here. We're still in the process of importing the database, so let's let that finish up. So again, in my subscription, what's going on here is I'm using pretty, I won't call them underpowered machines, but they're not exactly overpowered machines either. So for instance, there's only 3.5 gig available on this machine. And so, it's probably using a lot of that memory to run through here. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to come back to this. I'm just going to give this a few minutes to complete itself here, and then we'll come back to the demonstration. So what I want to do is I'm going to keep going because I want to talk about these different features that are available, right? So this is the basic database transaction unit, and it's the way that Microsoft defines how scalable your database is, right? And so, for instance, we just looked at the $5 a month transaction, $5 a month SKU, and that is showing you that it is the basic and that it can handle 5 of these, right? So you can scale out now. So for instance, and this pricing is approximate, right? I want to emphasize that, right? Use the pricing tool because of the snapshot that I took, right? This pricing is ever changing, but basically you can scale out to 4,000 of these things at $16,000 a month. So if you're going to be running heavy SQL loads all the time, you're looking up in here, and if you're running, I'd say moderate SQL loads, then you're looking somewhere in here. And again, this is just for development. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about elastic pools. Inside of Azure, you have the concept of an availability set for a virtual machine, and as your virtual machine needs increase, you can add your virtual machines inside of an availability set and set that to AutoScale. Right? This is a feature just for SQL Server that basically does the same thing. So for instance, your elastic pools, you can kind of see some of the metrics that are down here, and you can kind of see like max number of databases per pool, the storage, and so on and so forth. But the whole point is what you're doing is you're allowing these databases to auto-scale. Okay, so as your load increases, then you can auto-scale up and auto-scale back. Okay, and keep in mind that your limits here, for instance, you can start from 100 and scale up to 1,200, and then you can go from 125 up to 1,500. But you want to make sure that your database size is correct. Okay, so if you're exceeding 250 gigabytes, then you're coming up into this level. And again, this is all for development. So basically, my whole point is you want, instead of committing to paying for that high SQL server all the time, then you can pay for the services and the CPUs and the memory and all that you're using. Okay. Let's go back and have a look. Hopefully this is done. Great. We see successes all the way through. Oh, yep. So we've got that. We're going to close that off. And finally what I'll do is I'll refresh this guy. Right, so it's back. And then what I'll do is I'm going to switch back to Visual Studio here. Okay, so what we've done is, we called through the page load, and we've said that we want to, we're in this load employee right now. We're coming in here, we're saying get the connection to connect to this guy. We're going to use this stored procedure. We're going to pass the employee ID in. Finally, we're going to grab it, and then this guy knows how to create an employee given a data reader, and so that comes out. And then we'll return the entity. So the employee entity is here. If we just look over that and kind of expand it, you can kind of see the information is here, which is great. And then finally, we're just going to take advantage of .NET to create a generic list, add the entry, and then we're going to bind that to the grid. Okay, and then up will come the grid, and we've got an employee ID and some of the attributes that go along with it. Okay, so my whole point of this demonstration is, even though it's a pretty trivial demonstration, is that's a pattern that's being followed today, and that pattern can easily be moved into Azure. Now, so there are Azure Platform as a Service that you can also change your patterns, but you don't have to rewrite your applications to move everything to Azure. Okay, so that is it on the, let's go back to my slide, sorry. All right, so that is it on the SQL Server piece. So we're going to kind of change gears here, and we're going to talk about network connectivity into Azure. There are two primary, when I'm talking about primary connectivity, I'm talking about production here, right? So you can have a dedicated route, and that's a dedicated connection that's established through a partner like AT&T, Comcast, Level 1, Level 3, and so on and so forth. And you can see the bandwidth is 50 megabits to 10 gigabits. Okay. Now, there's also a site-to-site VPN, and in this case, you create an Azure VPN gateway. You assign a static IP address to it, and then in your data center, you create the connection through your firewalls, and then you establish all the routes into the VPN and the networks that you want to use. There's also a point-to-site configuration, and so that's a VPN from, say, a single computer like what I'm presenting from. So if you're a regular developer, you can go in and you can create your own VPN connection, and that can be certificate-based, that can be multi-factor authentication, right? So there's a lot of different possibilities there. And then again, site-to-site, that's done over IPsec. Let's see, the connection can be no more than 200 megabits. I've got a little typo on the slide, which I'll fix. But in any event, you're not going over 200 meg. And then finally, you're looking at express route. That's a dedicated connection, right? So if you have an MPLS network or you've got dedicated Ethernet running around, that's the same thing that you're talking about today. It's just that you're extending directly into Azure. So you can do private peering, which, and this is for express route, you can do private peering, which is extending your data center right into Azure. You can do public peering, which provides direct internet connections to the Azure services. And then Microsoft peering. So for instance, if you have a hybrid exchange environment, you can connect directly to Office 365 and you can bypass the other two. So in the link down below, that kind of shows the partners that offer the express route. Okay, that's connectivity at a high level, and now I want to talk a little bit about virtual networks. What are virtual networks? You're bringing your own network into the data center. So assuming that you have and there's a little bit of repetitiveness in here with the connectivity, but it assumes that you can create your own subnets, both public and private IP addresses. You can bring your own DNS. You can use your own DNS, or you can use Microsoft's DNS. And then again, I just kind of discussed the hybrid connectivity with the VPNs and ExpressRoute. You can pretty much support your own custom routing, and then there's network isolations. If you have VLANs, for instance, that are set up on your switches, they're not supported in Azure. So just be aware of that up front. Okay. This diagram really shows on the left what we have in a classic implementation today, on-prem implementation versus an Azure implementation, right? So you've got the internet, you've got your router, and you've got your typical firewall, a DMZ with your web services, and then you have your back-end firewall, okay? And you can kind of see your domain controller and where the DNS fits as well. And so you can pretty much take this whole concept and almost do a lift and shift into Azure. And so you have the whole Azure infrastructure that you're not directly responsible for. And then the network security groups basically take the place of the firewalls. And then finally you can see where your web servers are and public facing load balancers. And then you have your back-end databases and other services. You also have domain controllers that continue to stay in their place. And then so you've got the option to do an internal load balancer here, and Azure offers load balancing services here. And then finally, at this level, it offers, so right here where this public-facing load balancer would be, you can do this, and you could also put at another level, you could put a traffic manager and think of this as, say, US East versus US West, and then you could have your traffic manager pushing traffic between the regions. Okay, so that assumes that your applications are more or less stateless and can do that. So that's not something that Azure can handle for you. But if you write your applications to be stateless, then you're not using like a server affinity, then you can use that type of pattern. Okay, just a couple more benefits. So you can isolate your networks. All the VNets have access to both private and public networks. That's all set up, and you can limit all of that as well through your network security groups. The VMs all have access to each other. In this case, you saw where well, I didn't exactly show it, but the SQL server and the web server had full access to each other. That can be restricted. We did discuss name resolution a little bit, and the whole point of that is that you can use your existing DNS or you can migrate DNS to Azure. It really is kind of your choice. And then finally, you can use the network security groups as firewalls. I think we've covered that. And the connectivity we discussed also with the express route versus the site-to-site VPN. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about Lindmark. I've wrapped up the technical part of our presentation. What do? We're a consulting company. So we're a Microsoft managed partner. We're managed in Northern California. We're managed in New York Metro and also the Mid-Atlantic. We're also a gold certified partner, and you can see on the right that we do gold in the cloud platform, cloud productivity, data analytics, collaboration and content, and application development. Where we're a red carpet program, which just means there's no certification program. You can see that we do a lot with Azure IoT and then the Cortana Intelligence Suite. And again, this is a little bit just of the technologies that we really are able to present and work in, right? Anything from Microsoft Azure. We do a lot of work in the Cortana Analytics and IoT Suite. A ton of work on SharePoint in both migrating existing solutions from SharePoint 2010 and 2013 to the cloud. We do a lot of work with Office 365 and moving customers to the cloud. SQL Server and Power BI, a lot of work that we just help our customers understand their data and also present it back. And then you can see some of the other technologies that we work with as well. So with that, I'd like to finish up and thank everyone for their time. I am going to open this up to some questions and answers.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the informative session and a quick demo. I'm sure it's very useful to the audience here. The first question is, what are the options available for backing up virtual machines?
So, great question. So a lot of customers have existing backup solutions. Backup Exec and Commvault are two solutions, and they can continue to be used. So for instance, if you have a site-to-site VPN connection and you're moving that data over that line, that could get rather expensive. But you can also move your agents into the cloud, and so the backups can stay inside of Azure as well. So my whole point is that you can still use your agents, you can still use your backup. There's also the concept of using Microsoft Backup, and what you would do there is you would use, I guess they call it Azure Backup, so you would create a vault, and inside of that vault you'd schedule your backups to run just like you would any other backup. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, David. Yep. So the next question is, does Azure offer a virtual machine snapshot feature similar to VMware?
Right. So VMware offers a snapshot capability. It doesn't entirely take the entire snapshot. What Azure does is just a little bit different. It takes a complete snapshot and makes it read-only. So you can't modify the snapshot, but you can roll back from it. But one thing I would caution is as you're taking these snapshots, especially of large virtual machines, is that you can impact your storage, meaning the larger your snapshot, the more storage that you're going to take. And so you could run your pricing up the storage. And this is probably a very good case where you would want to be making sure you're using standard storage and then using the local redundant storage option on that so that you're not replicating that information across data centers. The other option, and I didn't discuss this at all today, is called Azure Site Recovery. And Azure Site Recovery allows those snapshots to kind of replicate themselves. And so that requires you putting an agent on your machine, and then you can kind of move them around as you need to.
Thanks, David. So the other next question is, what is the best way for me to start exploring Azure? Like, should I pay something, or is there a free trial? How does that work?
Okay, so Azure wants you to go, they want you to use their products. They want you to use cloud service. When you sign into Azure, you can create a trial subscription for 30 days. And what they end up doing is giving you $150 of credit. They do expect a credit card, and they're using that to validate that is who you are. At the end of the 30 days, they will not charge the credit card, but they will put your account, they'll disable your account and put it into an archive. And then you have, I think, another 30 days to convert that to a paid subscription. And then you can have access to your sources, your machines and things like that. I want to emphasize this is not a fully feature enabled Azure. And by that I mean you're limited to the number of cores, for instance, that you can host concurrently. I think it's a really low number. 4, 8, something like that comes to mind. And so as we've worked with our customers and they've started their trial subscriptions, we've had to go in and convert them to paid subscriptions and then put in support requests to, put them up to a more reasonable number of cores. So I just want to caution you that you're not going to be building out your entire data center on a Azure trial subscription.
Great, thanks. So the other question is, I have a lot of SQL server on premise. Can I use my licenses in Azure?
Yeah, so licensing can be complicated. If you are using Azure SQL, you're creating an Azure SQL database, right? They charge how they charge, right? I can't tell you exactly what the formula is for how they charge. But if you bring your own license, right, so you create an Azure VM with, say, Windows 2012, Windows 2016, whatever it is, and you bring your own image, right, so you have an ISO image that you would download from Microsoft, you bring that image with its product keys, right, then you can move that up, right, and so SQL is licensed, I think, per core right now. And so you want to make sure that you do your true-up or whatever with Microsoft. But yes, you can bring your SQL licensing into Azure. So just keep in mind that as you're doing that, you're still patching, you're still applying updates, and that's one of the advantages for using the Microsoft Azure. But if you pay for it, you should still continue to use it.
Thanks. So the next is on this, like, can I shut down Azure SQL databases?
Great question. So I showed shutting down the VMs to make sure that they were not running up against the clock. What you cannot do, like looking at my database server here, there is no place to shut that down. So what you can do is you can, I'm trying to see where that is here. Sure, is it the pricing tier here? Right, so you can change this, and so right now I'm set at S2 standard, and so that'll run out $75 a month, but what you can basically do is at the point where you're not using it, you can switch this over to Basic, and then that will allow, you're paying $5 a month for it at that point. And so thanks for bringing that up, because the other thing is I wanted to show inside of the virtual machines, if you were going to do the same thing, and you decide I need more horsepower here. Let's see, where is that? Size. Okay, so you can come here and, you'll see that we're waiting on my internet connection here. Okay, so I don't know why this isn't coming up, but the whole point is that you'll see the existing configuration, and you can change this. There they go. Okay, so we'll come down here. I've selected A0 Basic for this machine, and then if I need to move it up to A3 Standard, I can select that. I'm sorry, I didn't select A3. I selected A2. I have A2 Standard, and if I need to move that to, say, A3, A4, or some of these others, I can do that without shutting the machine down. Azure will take care of dynamically moving the machine for me. I hope that makes sense for everybody.
Thanks, David. I know we have a couple of more minutes. I think I have two more questions. Like, can I manage VNets from code?
Can I manage VNets from code? So, yes, you can. So that's the REST API that I was talking about earlier. And so Microsoft has a whole model available that you can, bind to. I don't have any samples of that right now, but yes. So the short answer is yes, you can. It's done through the REST API. And again, based on the level of management that you're requiring, I would start looking at the portal level, and then probably most of the infrastructure people I know are pretty decent with PowerShell, and so I would think that you may want to look there first, and then if you really need to get down into the weeds with a developer, the answer is yes, you can do that. That's like the last level that you want to be at, if that makes sense.
And what tools can I use for VNets?
So pretty much, I think I just kind of answered that question, but I'll reiterate that, right? So we've got the Azure portal, which I'm in right now, right? And so, for instance, if I come back here and I can pick, let's pick on all resources, I think. Right, so you can see that my virtual network is here. And this starts to lead you through. So, for instance, you can tag, you can look at the address spaces, you can look at connected devices, right? So there's a bunch of features that you can work with here, and if you need to get further down, then you're using PowerShell, and then finally, if you can't do it in PowerShell, then I would say Visual Studio is your last resort.
Great. Thanks, David, for taking up those questions. I know we are almost there. Again, thanks everyone for taking time to join this webinar, and I hope you found it informative. There are a few questions which are still unanswered, but we are sure that we will take it offline and come back to you in a day or two. Thanks, David, again. Wishing you all a very happy Thanksgiving. Have a good day.
Thank you.